All right, Shabbos, say good morning, a good night, everyone. Begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors, for the month of Nisan. To thank Czinn Teri Kahn Czinn for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month. With gratitude to Hashem, welcoming their first grandchild, Adin Tzvi Hochbaum, to Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Tziril for dedicating the shiurim and drashos this month. With appreciation to those who make the shiurim available beyond the confines of the Beis Midrash, specifically Moishe Abramson and Jeremy Lasson. Thank Shimmy Batsheva Messing for dedicating all the shiurim this month in honor of Bas Mitzva of their daughter Lilah, and to thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month in memory of Paul's parents, Shmuel ben Zechariah, Leah Bas Avrohom, and his great-grandmother Tziril Bas Rav Dov. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Neil and Pam Weissman, for dedicating the shiurim this week in loving memory of Pam's father, Hachazin Yisrael Zundel ben Yehuda Leib. And we also thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Nathan and Beth Adler, for dedicating the shir this morning in memory of Mr. Bernard Kiwi, Zichron Livracha, whose levaya is this morning. A beautiful dedication, a mentor and consummate gentleman. I remember his smile, thoughtfulness, warmth, humility, sweetness, and humor. Mr. Kiwi spent a lifetime showing the rest of us how to brighten a life and a world and bringing simcha to others as the shul candy man. He leaves a void that will not easily be filled, but he leaves a magnificent legacy. Yehi Zichro Baruch. Amen. Also, with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today, and I apologize, a little bit of a shortened time frame because of the Levaya this morning. My apologies for that. Today's daf is Yud Aleph 11. We are picking up Emir Hashem on Yud Amud Beis 10b. We're picking up Tana Rabbi Yehuda, which is right where we left off yesterday, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17 lines up from the bottom. So the Gemara says as follows: Tana Rabbi Yehuda Gud Godos Hakitoris v'chol karbanos hatzibor ba'in mitrumas halishka. So we'll say, remember again, resuming the really fascinating discussion about what funds pay for what things within the confines of or within the Beis Hamikdash. So now the Gemara Rabbi Yehuda says, that was his name, Rabbi Yehuda Gud Godos, says that halacha lamaisa, the ketores, as well as all communal offerings. Remember, ketores refers to the incense, as well as all communal offerings, ba mitrumas halishka. So trumas halishka refers again to the withdrawal of the machzis hashekel. So it was paid for from the machzis hashekel, the half shekel collection. Mizbeach hazav v'chol kli sharis, the golden altar. Remember again, the Mizbeach hazav was the inner altar on which ketores was offered. V'chol kli sharis, as well as any other service utensils, ba'in mimosar nisachim. They come from the leftover nisachim. Now, obviously, we saw this term in the Mishnah, and we have not yet defined it. We're going to define it on Yud Aleph and Aleph. But they are paid for from the leftover the nisachim. Now, of course, nisachim literally means what? Wine libations. So what exactly that means, we'll have to see. But apparently, again, there's another fund. Just remember this term, Mosar Nisachim. The funds from the leftover Nisachim. Mizbeach HaOlah, the altar for the Olah. Now, of course, the altar for the Olah refers to which altar? What we call the Mizbeach HaChitzon, which was the large altar outside of the actual, call it, structure of the Beis HaMikdash. We call it again the Mizbeach HaNechoshes, the copper altar. So Mizbeach HaOlah, v'ha'heichal v'azaros. All of these things, so the Mizbeach HaOlah, the Heichal, the Azaros. Now, both say, interestingly enough, here, the Gra, you see that little gimel in brackets? So the Gra changes the next two lines, which are incredibly important. See, he says, if you look at the little gimel, Mizbeach HaOlah, mi bedek ba'in mi bedek habayis. He says, ultimately, again, that comes from the Bedek Habayis fund. Now, we discussed this yesterday. Bedek Habayis was like a building fund. You know, this was a fund for the upkeep of the structure of the Beis Hamikdash. Chutz la'azaros, the Gra continues. Chutz la'azaros, ba'in mishyare halishka. Anything outside of the Azara, which is the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, anything outside of the Azara comes from shiure halishka, comes from the leftover of the machzis hashekel. So that's how the Gra changes that. The Gemara says, V'hatani avni hamizbeach ha'heichal v'azaros molin bahin. But yet we learned that the stones of the mizbeach, as well as the heichal and the azaros, you could commit mi'ilah if you misuse it. But if you tell me that it's paid for with the leftover machzis hashekel, is there any me'ilah from machzis hashekel? And of course, the answer to that is no. Amr B'chia, Klum Amr Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, Elo Kreb Meir. I will say, remember again, this is the famous shita of Rav Meir. When I say famous, I mean that we've quoted it, 4 times in the last 3 days. So Rav Meir holds, although in general we say that the leftover machzis hashekel is not subject to me'ilah, Rabbi Meir holds that it is. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir Amar Mo'alim B'Shirayim. Rabbi Meir says that in fact the leftover machzis hashekel is in fact subject to shirayim. Amr Rav Chia, Klumar Rav Meir El B'Zo Shnaso. But even Rav Meir only said that within the year. However, V'hacha Chutz Lishnaso Anu Kaimen. But yet again, we're talking about monies even used potentially outside of the year. Therefore, the Gemara says it can't be that these items mentioned above were paid for from the leftover machzis hashekel. So the Gemara kind of leaves that alone. The point that you begin to see from this, and the takeaway from this is that, remember, different things were paid for from different funds. I was speaking about this with Avron after the shir yesterday. That I will say, remember again, what the Gemara is trying to paint for us is an incredible picture of financial transparency. That's what's happening over here. Because I think a lot of times when you think about the Beis Hamikdash, you kind of assume money comes into a pot and you pay for whatever you have to pay for. It's like a general fund and everything. But what you begin to see from here is that is not the case. We'll say that again, there were different funds for different things. And remember, as we'll see, there was also an audit of each of these funds to see what was done with this money, to really highlight the idea that when it comes to communal funds, financial transparency is incredibly important. So the Gemara goes right here. The Gemara says, Amr Chizkiya, Tana Rabbi Yehuda Gudgudis. He says, Hashulchan v'amenor v'mizbechos v'aparoches ma'akvin esakabaros. We'll say a little bit of a switching gears for just a moment. So comes on Rabbi Yehuda and says as follows: the presence of the shulchan. Remember, the shulchan was the table upon which you would put the lechem upon him. The menorah, the mizbechos, 2 mizbechos, inner mizbeach for ketores, outer mizbeach for animal sacrifice. Parochas, which is the curtain which divides between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Ma'akvim esakabanos Remeir. Remeir holds all of these utensils, all of these items are necessary for the effectiveness of the karbanos. So, and I will say now, again, what's unique about this? What's unique about this is that all of these are items necessary for the karbanos, right? Again, think about it just a moment. I don't need a menorah to offer up ketores or to offer up an olah. I don't need a paroches for that. Obviously, I need a mizbeach. But even again, I don't need a mizbeach hazov, the inner mizbeach, to offer up an animal sacrifice. But yet, Rabbi Meir is explaining that all of these items, the presence of these items, are essentially fundamental to the very identity of the mikdash. And therefore, ultimately, again, without these items, one cannot offer up a karban. Say, once again, the Gra changes this. Rabbi Chacham disagree. They say the only thing that is necessary for a karban is the karkov and the keren. He changes, the Gra changes the gear. So we have kiyar v'hakin. Gra changes it to karkov, the keren. We'll say karkov was the decorative band that went around the mizbeach, and keren is a horn. Right? You will say again, if you ever see pictures of the mizbeach, the top of the mizbeach, both the inner mizbeach and the outer mizbeach, were not flat. On each corner, they had a protrusion that came up. It's called a horn. It's called the keren. So the Chachamim say the only thing that is ma'akev a karban is having a fully complete mizbeach, which includes even the karkov, the decorative band, as well as the horns. I will say, now this is really quite amazing if you think about this, just the musar of this. It's much more pronounced with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir holds that, I will say, you see, in general, for a karban, it's not just enough to offer up the animal or to offer up the ketores, but you need the avirah, you need the atmosphere to be correct and to be complete. Rabbi Meir is much more dramatic. According to Rabbi Meir, for an effective karban, you need a menorah, you need a shulchan, you need a parochas, you need all of these things. Which I will say, what I think what Rabbi Meir is trying to highlight is that spiritual success is not just dependent on doing the right actions. Spiritual success is fundamentally dependent on setting yourself up in the right atmosphere. And we know this from our own lives. If my surroundings are not conducive to my spiritual growth, it's very difficult to get real traction. It's just the way that it is. You could offer up the right karban, you could offer up the right ketores, you could do all the right things, but if you're not surrounded by the right spiritual accoutrement or accessories, it's just hard to get real movement. Even the Chachamim agree with that. The Chachamim is just the shaila ultimately again of how far you take it. So as Rabbi Meir will require you ultimately to have all of these things, the Chachamim just say the karkov and the karen is enough. The Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, V'lochin Amar Rabbi Laz, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina, Trehan Amran, Kolhein Dechsev Nochach Ma'akev, Tzela Ina Ma'akev. So we'll say now another opinion. Other opinion, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina, hold it as follows. Whenever the Torah uses lashon of nochach means opposite, right? So the Torah will say, this item has to be placed opposite this. Wherever the Torah uses that lashon, so the Torah is makbid on the placement, that means that item is an indispensable cog in the wheel of sacrificial service. Tzela, whenever the Torah uses word like to the side, tzela means the side. To the side of something, then the presence of that item is now ma'akeh for sacrificial service. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, kishem, or b'shem, Rabbi Yonasan, excuse me, va'afilu tzela ma'akeh. So another opinion, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, name of Rabbi Yonasan, no, even when it says tzela, even when the Torah tells you that this item must be on the side of something else, ultimately that is ma'akev as well. Va'am Rabbi Ilah, b'shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, va'afilu sima ma'akev. I will say, interestingly enough, now another opinion, Shlomo bar Nachman says, even when the Torah just uses a lashon of sima, placing something, that tells you that that item is an indispensable part of sacrificial service. To which the Gemara says, how do you reconcile all of these different opinions? This is very interesting. Rabbi Chanina, kan ba'avodos shebifnim, kan ba'avodos shebochot. So both said this is actually quite interesting. So it comes on Rabbi Chanina and makes a distinction between inner avodah and outer avoda, right? They will say inner avoda referring to avoda, sacrificial service, or temple service, that's done inside of the heichal, inside of the actual structure of the Beis Hamikdash, versus avoda done bachutz, outside of the heichal. So it will say, if you take a look for a moment at the Karban Ha'eda, for just a moment, which is the top parish on the left-hand side, he writes over here, kan ba'avodo shebifnim, Kisheba la'avo bifnim kulam ma'akvin. But say essentially, whenever you do an avoda inside, it's actually very interesting. When you do the avoda inside, all of the utensils are ma'akev. Pretty much, you need everything in place. Anytime the Torah mentioned the placement of something, with whatever verbiage it used, sima, tzela, nochach, that tells you that that is a necessary piece of sacrificial service. However, again, the Karban either goes on about ba'avodas chutz eino ma'akiv elakir v'hachim bilvad. But ultimately, again, for avodas chutz, for again sacrificial service on the large outer altar, the only thing that's a necessity is the band of the mizbeach, and ultimately, again, the horns. So we'll say an interesting distinction. So the way the Gemara ends off over here is, for the avoda bifnim, pretty much you need everything. That's kind of what it comes down to. You need anything that says, nochach, sima, tzela. For the avoda bachutz, pretty much all you need is an intact mizbeach. But again, you need even the fully intact mizbeach with the decorative band, the karkov, and the chronos and the horns at each corner. Beautiful. Both an incredible Gemara. Rabbi Chanina. Shachtis gidol haise b'mnei kohanim gidolim. Both listen to this. The kohanim gidolim often acted in an arrogant fashion, or pompous fashion. How so? We'll say, what a terrible statement. Listen to this. Sheyoser mishishim ki karei zav hayu motziim ba shahaya kivsha. Okay, kivsha shal para omeid v'lo haya echer men motzi parasa bekivsha shal chavera. Listen to this, Rabbi said, because remember again we saw in the Mishnah a discussion regarding the ramp of the para aduma. Right? Remember again, the para aduma was taken from the Beis Hamikdash, ultimately again to Har HaZeisim, where it was slaughtered, and then again the ashes were brought back from the Har HaZeisim to the Beis Hamikdash. Interestingly enough, now what's the machlokes in the Mishnah? What was the machlokes in the Mishnah? What was the machlokes in the Mishnah? Who paid for it? Right? Remember again, who paid for the kevesh? So we had one opinion that said, where did it come from? Right? Shiari halishka First opinion of the Mishnah said that it came from the left over Machzis HaShekel, but then we saw a second opinion of the Mishnah that no, the Kohanim Gedolim used to pay for it. So now comes along Rabbi Chanina and says the Kohanim Gedolim used to act in a very arrogant, almost, showy fashion. That what happened? Every Kohen Gadol insisted on building his own ramp and would not use the ramp of his fellow Kohen Gadol. Even if the ramp was already there. Even if there was still a ramp in existence from the last Para Aduma, every Kohen Gadol insisted on building his own. And I both say it was an exorbitant amount of money. There's two yourselves. Either it was 60 kikar of gold or 60 kikar of silver. Either way, that's a lot of money. So interestingly enough, Rabbi Chanina understands that it was a display of arrogance. It was a display of arrogance that every Kohen wanted to build his own Para Aduma bridge. So Hesiv Rab Ula Kumei Rab Mana. So Rabbi Ula says, Rabbi Chanina, I think you're wrong. Meaning, you're right, but you're wrong. You're right that each Kohen Gadol built his own bridge, but it was not because of arrogance or a desire to display their wealth. It was for a different reason. I'll tell you how I know this. V'atani Shimon HaTzadik. Both say Shimon HaTzadik. Who is Shimon HaTzadik? Shimon HaTzadik Mishayarei K'anshe Knesses HaGedola. So Shimon HaTzadik, there were two Para Adumas in his lifetime, which I will say is pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. Most times it's once a generation. Two Para Adumas in his lifetime. What happened? So Shtei Paros Asa Lo Bekevesh Shehotzizeh Hoziezeh. And yet I will say, interestingly enough, Shimon HaTzadik did not use the same ramp both times. Then I both say, now this is Shimon HaTzadik, presumably he built the first ramp, and now for the second Para Aduma, he built the second ramp. So what are you going to tell me now? He's trying to outdo himself? So some people are like that, right? Some people try to outdo themselves, and I will say in general, trying to outdo yourself, at least in matters of ruchnius, is an excellent thing. But I don't know that most people try to outdo themselves in matters of gashmius. So what are you going to tell me now? That Shimon HaTzadik built a second ramp because he wanted to outdo himself? That doesn't make sense. So I will say, listen to this. So Islacha L'Meimer Shimon HaTzadik Shachatzaya? Are you going to say that Shimon HaTzadik was so pompous and arrogant that he wanted to outdo the very bridge that he built? So the Gemara says, My Kidon, Al-Shem Maile Hibepara, Silsil Hibepara. Both say the reason they built a new bridge each time for Para Aduma was to reinforce in the eyes of the general populace how careful you had to be with Para Aduma. See, I both say, remember again, Para Aduma, besides the fact that finding a para which conforms to all the details of the service is so difficult, but Lamaisi, remember again, I both say, Tuma lurks everywhere. It's a good musr in life in general, right? Tuma lurks everywhere. But specifically for Para Aduma, it will say one wrong move, one wrong turn, one person is not careful, everything falls apart. Everything falls apart. So we'll say, so the Gemara suggests something amazing. They used to construct a brand new bridge for Para Aduma each and every time. Because we'll say, what happens when you construct? Think about this just a moment. We'll say, there's a distance between the Harabayis and Harazesim, right? I've mentioned this before. You can go, we know this spot on Harazesim where they used to do the Para Aduma. Now it's a monastery. But you can go there today, and you could look right into Harab. I've been there. It's incredible. I mentioned this before. My boys, their bar mitzvah parshas Chukas, Para Aduma. So in the summer before their bar mitzvah, we were in Eretz Yisrael, and we went to the spot where they did the Para Aduma. They practiced their kriya right on that spot of the Mamsha, the Para Aduma. You look right onto Harabayis. It's magnificent. We'll say that's a big bridge. It's a big bridge. So remember, again, why did they do this, says the Gemara? They did this in order to create a lot of commotion about the Para Aduma, so that the people should realize, hey, there's a Para Aduma, and that the people should realize how careful you have to be with Para Aduma. This wasn't done as a sign of pomposity. Is that a word? Pompousness, right? Good. This wasn't the pomposity or the arrogance of the Kohen Gadol. This was to highlight in the eyes of the people how careful you have to be with Para Aduma. Other examples of this. Tani, Zizin Uksalim Hayuyotzi Mikana Mikana. Both is incredible. They had protrusions and walls This was like essentially a covered bridge, but a covered bridge without the roof. I don't know, I guess you don't call that a covered bridge. Right? A walled bridge. As I was saying, the bridge was not open on the sides. Why not? So the Gemara says, Shelo yatsu v'yatzitza kan v'itamu. Because what didn't we want? See, I will say, here's the problem. The problem is, they didn't want Kohanim looking over the side of the bridge. Because I will say, what could happen? Technically speaking, if there is a corpse below, tuma, ola, ubokas. Right? Tuma goes up. So even if there's a tuma, even if there's a mace in the valley below, somebody gets a little bit curious. They like heights. They want to see what's going on below. They could ruin the entire process. So both Rabbi said, it turns out that yes, historically, Rabbi said it's fascinating. Historically, I don't know, somebody will have to look up this information, but I'm sure it exists. Historically, they built a new bridge every single time they went ahead and they brought the paraduma. How many bridges was that over time? I don't know. But Lamaisa, they built a new bridge, but not because of the arrogance or pomposity, because of the Kohanim Gidon, Chas Shalom. Just the opposite. To highlight in the eyes of the people the care and concern which went into the production, or the process, I should say, of paraduma. Really incredible. What's that? Can you imagine? Meretz Hashem, we're going to see that, right? Because remember again, there's going to have to be a number of paros adumos. I guess when Mashiach comes, one of two things are going to happen. Either we're going to say Tuma Hutra B'tzibor. That's possible because everybody's tamei. So maybe we're just going to, even the Kohanim, maybe we're just going to say Tumah Utra B'tzibor, and the Beis Hamikdash is going to come down, and in Eretz Hashem we're going to have Paraduma after the fact, or maybe Paraduma is going to be first. I don't know what they're going to do, but it's going to be amazing to see that bridge. It's going to be incredible to see that bridge whenever it's built, especially again, maybe it'll be I don't know, maybe they won't have to reconstruct it every time. I don't know. Whatever it is, in Eretz Hashem, we'll be Zochem Eretz Hashem to see it B'karov. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ein Mistakrin. So we'll remember again, Rabbi Akiva, there was a whole discussion then in the Mishnah about what you do with leftover monies. Right? Remember again, the Mishnah said, Mosar Shiare Lishka Mahayu Osim Bahan. What did they do with leftover monies in the Beis Midrash? Remember again, Rabbi Akiva said, what would we do? We would purchase, the Beis Midrash would purchase wine, oil, fine flour, and they would go ahead and sell it at a profit. Remember again, that was Rabbi Akiva. That was Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva said, no, we don't do commerce with communal funds. We don't come with communal funds. So it says the Gemara, Ela imratza yehefsid shalom v'asach lahekdish mutar. So it's very interesting. Rabbi Akiva says there is one way that I'll agree to this. If somebody wants to take responsibility to invest the money of the Beis Hamikdash with the following stipulation, they bear all of the loss, and the profit is shared. You could enter. Then Rabbi Akiva says, under those circumstances, you can go ahead and invest money of Hegdish. Kahada bar zemina ispakid gabe model diyasvin. The Gemara tells a story because what says it doesn't just apply to Beis Hamikdash money. This applies to any time that you are the custodian of money. So listen to this. This guy bar zemina ispakid gabe model diyasvin. He was put in charge. He was essentially the executor of the estate of young orphans. So he was in charge of their money. Also, Rabbi Mana, he came and he asked Rabbi Mana, can I invest the money of the Yisomim? Right? This guy was the executive, this guy Bar Zemina, and he wanted to grow the money of the estate of the Yisomim. So can I invest the money of the Yisomim? So Amrlei, in boys DF Seder Didach, the Igra Tatarvaichen Shari, if you are willing to go ahead and invest it in a way where ultimately, again, you bear all of the loss, and the profits are split, then einachinami, you can do that. I both say, now remember again, there's a difference here with the money of Yisomim, the money of the Mikdash. Bepashtos, if you invest the money of the Mikdash, who does the profit belong to? The Beis HaMikdash. So remember again, if you want to invest the money of the Beis HaMikdash and you're willing to say, I'll bear all the loss and essentially none of the gain, right? Because again, you're doing this, that technically you could do that. But by the Yisomim, it's a little bit different. Apparently, by the Yisomim, the executor is permitted to share in some of the profit with that. Again, I will say, these are more like Baba Metzia Sugis that we'll see. Reb Chia bar Ada ispakid gabe medal diasmin v'avikin. Same idea. Reb Chia bar Ada was an executor of the estate for Yisomim. And halach lamaisa, Halacha l'maisa, he went ahead and invested the money, bearing all of the loss and splitting the profit. So both say, interestingly enough, and apparently even Rabbi Akiva, right? So Rabbi Akiva, who was against using surplus funds to buy oil, wine, and wheat to sell at a profit, agreed that if somebody is willing to go ahead and say, I'll bear all of the loss, and ultimately go ahead and give the gain to the Beis HaMikdash, then Allah said that would work. I will say, of course, it presupposes that what? Obviously, I guess you'd have to run the financials on the guy who is willing to do this, right? Because somebody obviously has to, or collateralize some type of property, that if indeed there is a loss, he really does have the ability to secure it. Good. Let's go back there. Moser Peros. So we'll say, remember again, the Mishnah introduced us to the idea that, Chavran Zoom, you with me? Everyone is all right there? Good, you still hear me? Excellent. All right, good. It's wonderful to see everyone. Baruch Hashem. All right, so the Gemara says as follows. Moser Peros. So we'll say, if you remember again, the Mishnah introduced us to two new terms. Moser Peros and Mosar Nesachim. So these were two more funds, two more sources of money. Mosar Peros, which literally means leftover fruit, and Mosar Nesachim, which means leftover libations. The Mishnah did not tell us what those funds were. Now we're going to see. So it says the Gemara, Mosar Peros, Masnisin Drabi Shmoli, Drabi Chia Bar Yosef, Pasar Masnisa, Mosar Peros. What does Mosar Peros mean? Schar lehekdish, or I should say Mosar Peros schar lehekdish. So we'll say, interestingly enough, Mosar Peros are profits which accrue to hekdish through the sale of wine and oil. Through the sale of wine and oil. Now we'll say, now understand something. We saw this back in the last cycle of Daf Yomi Maseches Tamid and other of the smaller Masechtas. In the Beis HaMikdash, they always had a supply of animals, wine, oil, fine flour. Why? Because I will say, think about this. If you're coming to the Beis HaMikdash and you're traveling from a distance, you don't really want to go ahead and start. I don't want to use the word schlepping because these are sacrificial items. You don't want to start carrying items with you. So what would happen? I will say again. The first sisterhood gift shop, right? A little bit of a throwback, right? Was at the Beis HaMikdash, right? But they didn't sell, silk talisim and embroidered talis bags, but rather they went ahead and they sold sacrificial items. I will say, obviously, they sold it at a premium. Right? This was there in order to go ahead and profit. So interestingly enough, so Rabbi Shmuel holds, or Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef holds, that what the Mishnah called Mosar Peros was the profits that came to Hekdish through the sale of wine and oil. That's Mosar Peros. Interesting wording. Mosar Nesachim. What does Mosar Nesachim mean? Zu Sa'araviyah. So we'll say this is fascinating. Sa'araviyah, so we'll say, means as follows. The Beis HaMikdash would enter into contracts with merchants. And the contracts of merchants said like this, that halacha l'maisa, we're going to purchase, let's say, flour at 4 sa'ah for a selah, right? 4 sa'ah flour for a selah. Let's say the price of flour goes up. Now you can only get 3 sa'ah of flour for a selah. The Beis HaMikdash contracts were locked in. Now they were only locked in though in one direction. They were always locked in only to the benefit of the Beis HaMikdash. So if the price of flour were to go down, then Einachinami, again, the Beis HaMikdash would be able to take advantage of the new prices. So the Gemara says over here, Mosar Nesachim is what they call the Sa'ar Revius. That even if the price of flour went up, it would turn out that the Beis HaMikdash would end up getting more flour for the same selah. That leftover amount, Rabbi Chia holds, is called Mosar Nesachim. Rabbi Yochanan, Pasar Masnisa, Mosar Peros, Osar. We'll say now we have machlokes about the definitions. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Mosar Peros, that's what we call Sa'ah Revius. That's the extra Sa'ah that the Beis HaMikdash would get even if the price of flour went up because their contracts were locked in. Mosar Nesachim, what does Mosar Nesachim mean? Leberutzin. We'll say this is fascinating. Berutzin means that when you sold flour to the Beis HaMikdash, see, I will say normally, if you sell flour, let's say I'm selling a sa'ah of flour to you, 1 sa'ah. So I go ahead and I have a sa'ah receptacle. We'll say I pour flour into the receptacle, then what do I do at the end? I smooth out the top of the receptacle, which makes sense. You're buying a sa'ah flour, you get a sa'ah. When you sold the Beis HaMikdash, you had to, what's the right word? Thank you. You had to heap it, if that's the right word. Right? You had to heap the amount. So in fact, the Beis Hamikdash ended getting a what? A sa'ah plus a little. A sa'ah plus a little. That's called berutzin, right? You overflow the utensil of it. I have a less lay that Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef liberutzin. Does Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef not hold the berutzin? Because remember again, in Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef's model, he only had two things. He had number one, what he called the profits from the sale of wine and oil, and ultimately again what he called sa'ah revius, which was the extra amount you get from locking in contracts. But he doesn't mention anything about berutzin, about overflowing the utensils. No, he does. He just held that ultimately again what we call sa'ah revius. So remember again, the Gemara is calling sa'ah revius means Beis Hamikdash contracted with me to sell them 4 sa'ah of flour for 1 selah. Now the price of flour goes up. Now you can only get 3 sa'ah of flour for 1 selah. I am still obligated to honor the contract and provide 4 sa'ah per selah. So that 4th sa'ah, that's profit. That's called sa'ah revius. Rabbi Chia holds that sa'ah revius and berutzin, which means the heaping of the utensils, the overflow amount. Is that the correct word? You understand what I mean, right? The heaping of the utensils, that all goes to the same fund. Al-daite Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef necha. So according to Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef's approach, it makes sense when we say, Ein mistakrin b'shal hekdish, af lo b'shal aniyim. One does not do business with hekdish, one does not do business, really like invest the funds in a more aggressive way. For hekdish, for tzedakah, lefichach zeh vazeh, lo hayu modin beperos. Therefore, again, both agreed that halacha l'maisa. Both agreed that the case of peros, in the case of peros, we'll see what that means in just a moment. If you take a look actually at the all right, we'll see. We'll pick up on the Karbana Eda in just a moment. Fine. Both agree the Hayamodim Peros. Both agreed ultimately going to both say that the leftover amounts were not used. Al Daiti Rabbi Yochanan Kashya. But according to your approach, Rabbi Yochanan, we have a problem. V'hataninan Amdu Migimol. You spoke with that. Both say that's the case of Saravias. Right? Let's say again, Beis Hamikdash contracted with me to provide for them 4 sa'ah per selah. But then the price of wheat went up, or price of flour went up. You could only get 3 sa'ah per selah. I still have to provide the Beis Hamikdash with the contract amount. V'taninon zev v'zalo ha'imodim beperos lo ha'imodim beperos ha'ketzam mizbeach avamodin ha'yu b'kli shari. So we'll say ultimately again they agreed. They did not agree that the leftover peros ultimately again go to the Ketzam Mizbeach. Remember again, Ketzam Mizbeach, we keep using this term. We will get into it more, but Ketzam Mizbeach means we never want the Mizbeach to be dormant. So there was like a supplemental sacrificial fund that whenever for some reason there were no karbanos going on the Mizbeach, the Beis Hamikdash was able to furnish its own karbanos. But they did agree that what they called the leftover peros, they did not agree that what they called the leftover peros would fund the Ketzam Mizbeach, but they did agree that the leftover what we call the leftover peros would fund Kli Shares. Ad Kidon Berutzei Tzibor. So the Gemara says, well, let me analyze this. Can the leftover, remember again, Berutzei Tzibor means the surplus funds from the heaping of the measures to the Beis Hamikdash. So Rabbi said there was profit. There was profit gained from that. So is that profit permitted to be used to purchase Kli Shares? So Rabbi say, what's the problem with that? See, remember again, Rabbi said the problem with it is what happens if that heaping is coming from an individual. Rabbi said this goes back to yesterday's sugya, which is certain items, a whole discussion about whether or not something given by an individual could be transformed into something communal. So the Gemara says, if you accept the overbrimming, right, the heaping of an individual, does it, and you use that surplus to purchase Kli Sharis, does it not effectively mean that Kli Sharis are coming from the donations of an individual? But how could that happen? Kli Sharis has to come from communal funds. Kehada de Taninan is what we learned yesterday. Isha sha'asta kisonat libna kshira o bilvache timserena letzivra. So we learned this already yesterday. That halacha l'maisa, this was the case of the woman who made a tunic, big day kahuna, for her son. She wants her son to wear the big day kuna that she made. The big day kuna has to come from communal funds, to which the Gemara answered, it works as long as what? As long as what? She gives it over to the tzibor. She gives it over to the tzibor. So Rabbi say, even if you want to say that the klishares ultimately again is being funded from the overbrimming of individuals, as long as they are giving it over to the Beis Hamikdash, it works. So the Gemara goes weiter. Ad kidon beirut zelach. I feel the So we'll say again, up until now, we've been speaking about the overbrimming with a liquid measure. What about the overbrimming with solid measures? Kahi de tanin antamon hanesachim shekidshu b'kli. If you have libations that became a kudash in a utensil, v'nimtza hazebach puzzle, and then it turns out that, remember again, I will say, you don't normally bring nesachim by themselves. Nesachim accompany an animal carbon. So let's say again, you have the nesachim, they were sanctified in a klisharis. Then the carbon itself becomes disqualified. Im yesh sham zevach acher yakrivu imo. If there's another carbon, you just offer up that nesachim with this other carbon. Ve'im lav, and ultimately again, if there's not another carbon, lanu, let them sit overnight, and yufsulu balina, and ultimately again, they will become disqualified by sitting overnight. Therefore, Basa, you see over here that halacha lamaisa, an item, nesachim only become kadosh if they are sitting in a klisharis. Right? In other words, so nesachim cannot become kadosh if sitting in a regular kli, only in a klisharis. Therefore, again, halacha lamaisa, any overbrimming, right? If that's the right word, overbrimming or heaping, where halacha lamaisa, again, the excess amount was not in a kli, was not in a klisharis, it would not become kodesh. Good. Shabbosai. So the takeaways from this sugya, first of all, interestingly enough, we're now introduced to new funds, right? We see moser haperos, moser nesachim. There's a machlokis what these mean. But here, right, so machlokis is exactly what the definition is, but we know what they represent are the excess amounts from what we'll call advantageous contracts, the supply contracts to the Beis Hamikdash. Because when you supplied anything to the Beis Hamikdash, you got locked in at a certain amount. And even if the price went up, you had to honor the contract. Of course, if the price went down, the Beis Hamikdash has a right to renegotiate. That surplus amount represents profit. That's a new fund, right? So that's what we call Sa'ad Dalid, right? Sa'ad Dalid. Then there's also, I will say, the overbrimming or heaping amounts. That was also a source of excess. That was Beirutzin. And then ultimately, again, the next one was the profits through the sale of wine and oil. So 3 new funds, or really 3 new sources of funds, were introduced to in this Gemara. We also saw the Kohanim each of the Kohanim are building their own bridge, not pomposity or arrogance, but halakha l'maaseh, again, as a show of reverence for the paradumuk. Let's go weiter. Says the Mishnah, most ketoras mahay osam. It was very interesting. We'll say the leftover ketoras. What would they do with it? It's really fascinating. We'll say, so again, we don't have time to get into it, but you'll take a look on your own on the Tiklin Chadatin. There was almost always leftover ketoras. Almost always leftover ketoras. Now, you'll say to yourself, we'll just use it next year. You can't do that, Rabbi Silber, because remember again, ketoras always had to come from the current year's funds. So now, what do you do if you have leftover ketoras? This is actually quite fascinating. So, mafishin mimena schara umnin. So we'll say, here's what they would do. They would pay the workers, right? The umnin, we'll see which workers, but the umnin of the Beis Midrash, they would pay them with leftover ketoras. Then we'll say, but 1 second, you can't pay workers with ketoras. Why not? Ketoras is kodesh. So watch what they would do. So hayimafishin mimena schara umnin umechalelin osa al schar maosa umnin. Watch this, Rabbi say. So here's what they would do. So let's say again, one of the workers was owed $1,000. So they would designate $1,000 worth of ketoras as the salary for one particular worker. And then what would they do? Then they would separate money from the Beis Hamikdash. So also, B'Pashtos, remember again, where do you pay the workers from? That also sounds like you would get paid from the Machtis HaShekel. Then they would separate out some money from the Lishka of the Machtis HaShekel. And what would they do? They would go ahead, they would redeem the Ketores onto the money. The Nosnin Osel Umnin. And I will say now, effectively what they did was deconsecrate the Ketores onto the money. We'll say, watch this. The Nosnin Osel Umnin, then they would pay the umnin, the workers, with ketores, and then the chosin velochin osa mitruma chadasha. Both say this is great. And then they would repurchase the ketores from the umnin with that year's new machzis hashekel. So we'll see here what just happened over here. There's two things that are happening over here. We need to pay the workers. But we'll say, what else do we want to do? We want to be able to use any leftover ketores. But you can't use leftover ketores. Why not? Because leftover ketores was purchased with last year's machzis hashekel. So I can't use it, right? Once Nisan rolls around, I need to use ketores that was purchased with this year's machzis hashekel. So we'll say, this is brilliant. Only Jews come up with these ideas. Right? So we'll say, watch this. So what do? We essentially say, okay, we're going to pay the workers with ketores. Well, so in order to do that, you have to deconsecrate ketores. So what do? We separate out ketores, equivalent to the worker's wage. Then we separate out machzis hashekel, equivalent to, at least we think is machzis hashekel. We're going to change that in just a moment. We separate out money from the mikdash, equivalent to the worker's wage. We deconsecrate the ketores onto the money, pay the workers with the ketores, and then what? Repurchase the now deconsecrated ketores with this year's machzis hashekel. Incredible. And I both said that way the workers have gotten paid with real money because no one really wants to get paid with ketores, right? And this way, again, because we repurchased the ketores with this year machzis hashekel, we now have the ability to use it in the current year. So it says the Gemara, V'im ba chodesh bizman alokin osa mitshuma chadasha v'im labnei yeshana. Fine. So we'll say, so the Mishnah just adds in over here, and if the new monies came in, right, the new machzis hashekel came in time, we repurchase the ketores with the new machzis hashekel. But if not, if we have no choice, we have to repurchase it with the old machzis hashekel. So the Gemara says, 1 second. V'lo nimtza hektish mischala ala hektish. We'll say, how does that work? In other words, in order to deconsecrate something, what do you need to do? You need one item that's consecrated, and what? And what? One item that's chulin. I said the problem over here is if you're deconsecrating ketores on machzis hashekel, then what Rabbi say? They're both kodesh. So how can you deconsecrate ketores onto collected machzis hashekel, which is kodesh as well? To which the Gemara says, so I'm Rabbi Shimmy Batsheva Messing, maybe maos. So Rabbi said, by the way, there's one more step. Maybe maos u'mechalalin ala binyan. Rabbi said, this is great. You see, whenever there was like stuff built in the Beis Hamikdash, or for that, not necessarily in the Mikdash proper, but even in the azoras, in the walls surrounding when the item was built, it was chulin, it was unconsecrated. It was then subsequently consecrated. So what you would do, Rabbi say, is as follows: you would bring the money from the Beis Hamikdash, and you would transfer the sanctity of the coins onto the newly built structures, thereby deconsecrating the coins. Once the coins were deconsecrated, then what? Then you could deconsecrate the ketores onto the coins, and then so let's finish. Umevi amud beis, umevi ketores mechal aleim, ve'nosa osa le'umnin bischara. We'll say yulal from the beis. We'll say so now I have the complete picture. What's the complete picture? We'll say I take leftover ketores. I separate the leftover ketores as wages for the umnin, for the workers. I then take money from, let's call the machzis hashekel. I then deconsecrate the machzis hashekel onto newly built structures, or newly built walls, whatever it is. Transfer the sanctity of the coins onto the structures. Now the coins are chulin. Once the coins are chulin, then what? I deconsecrate the ketores onto the coins, pay the umnin with the ketores, and then hopefully again take from the New Year's shekel, and what? Last step, repurchase the ketores. Therefore, the umnin get their wages in coinage. We get to repurchase the ketores and reuse the ketores for the coming year. Incredible. So we'll say, what happens with that money? Right? What ultimately, again, should we do? I will say, take a look at the Carbon Aida. He says on the top line, so we'll say, the original coins that ultimately, again, were used for the deconsecration of the ketores, what do you do with them? Right? Because we'll say, remember again, we're using those coins to deconsecrate the ketores, and then we're paying the umnin with the ketores, but which coins are you repurchasing the ketores back with? The new machzis hashekel. So I have these coins now that were used for the deconsecration of the ketores. What do you do with them? So we'll say this is incredible. So Rebbe Omer, Ani, Yinasnu Lebeis Garmu Lebeis Sabatinas. So we'll say, interestingly enough, Rebbe says, I use them to pay the families of Garmu and Avatinas. So we're going to see this in Shabbos' daf. I use them to pay the families of Garmu and Avatinas, who were the families who were in charge of making the ketores and making the lechem aponim. So incredible. So in other words, because of those coins essentially were vested with ketores sanctity, I could do what? I could use them to pay for the production of ketores and lechem aponim. Now we'll say, why lechem aponim is lumped in there? We'll see. No, not today. We'll see that over Shabbos. Hashem. That only works assuming that you owed money to Garmu and Avatinas, that you owed money to these families for the production of ketores and lechem haponim. So the Gemara says, if you take a look at the Karban HaEdah again, I'll switch to Karban HaEdah a little bit today. Second line, Vehein, Karban HaEdah writes, V'hushi chayav alahan lebeis garmu ma'os mishana sha'avra. Right, Rabbi say, remember again, this is so fascinating. Everything is so fast. Everything's interconnected. Remember, this is about to become old money. Right? Old money. Remember, we'll say, why am I going through this whole exercise? Because remember, the clock is ticking. The year is coming to an end. Nisan is here, which means any leftover ketores really is unusable because it was bought with last year's shekalim. The only way to salvage it is to repurchase it with New Year's shekalim. So the Gemara says, New Year's shekalim. So the idea the Gemara says over here is that you could, now remember, so everything works out beautifully for the umnin. The problem is now, what do I do with the money that was used to deconsecrate the ketores, which essentially now has some level of ketores sanctity? So the Gemara says, no problem. Just pay for ketores and lechem aponim with that money. It's perfect. Give it to the Garmu family. The Avatinas, these were the families who had the secret to the production of ketores and the secret to the production of lechem aponim. The Gemara says, perfect. As long as what? There was an accounts receivable with the Garmu and Avatinas family. As long as you owed them money from the quote unquote past year, you're good to go. What happens if halacha l'maisa? What if you didn't know that money? Let's say again, I will say you're all paid up with the Garmu family, Avatinas family. So what do you do with this money upon which ketores was deconsecrated? I will say, this is riveting. No, this is really, I guess, like, it's funny, I left accounting, but I guess there's a part of me that still likes it. Right? I will say, this is actually quite fascinating, right? So what are you going to do with this money? So the Gemara says, Asa Rabbi Ba, B'Shir Rabbi Chia, B'Shir Rabbi Yossi, Mekaitzin Ba Mesam Mizbeach. Oh, Rabbi say, what would you do with it? See, Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. The default is you use it for the Keitz HaMizbeach fund. Rabbi say, the Keitz HaMizbeach fund means what? Dessert of the Mizbeach. Once again, this goes back to what we said before. We never allow the Mizbeach to remain idle. We never want the Mizbeach to remain idle. So therefore, again, there's a fund. There's a carbon fund. The carbon fund is, we always have, so we'll say, interestingly enough, what you begin to see is, when in doubt, or kind of like, when I have nowhere else to put the money, or I don't know exactly where to allocate it, so, where do you allocate it to? Keitz HaMizbeach. So again, if, in other words, the most natural thing to use this money upon which ketores was deconsecrated was to pay the Garmu and Avatinas family. But that only works if you owed them money from this year. But if you didn't owe them any money, then in Echanami Keitz HaMizbeach. Incredible. Rabbi Ba Bar Koin Boy Kumei Rabbi Yosa Machlafa Shitasi Rabbi Chia Bar Ba. Ultimately, Rabbi Chia Bar Ba, his shita seems to be contradictory. Why? Taman Tziril. He just asked the question about what we do with the money. They call pshitale, but later on he seems to really give a definitive answer about what to do with the money. To which the Gemara says, Had tzrichale b'kli sharis. What he was asking Rabbi say was, if let's say again the Garmu and Avatinas family are paid up, and therefore again halacha l'maisa, there is no one else, there is no one to pay with the money. So his question was, can you use it for kli sharis? The pshitale b'keitz HaMizbeach. That was his question. Can I use this money to purchase service utensils? What was clear to him is they certainly could be used for the Keitz HaMizbeach fund. Despalgun, because there's a machlokas, pitma b'chulin. We'll say, what if we'll say pitma means you made the ketores. Pitma literally means compounded. If you compounded the ketores, you made the ketores, in a kli sharis. Or bechulin means an unconsecrated utensil. Rabbi Yossi, Bei Rabbi Chanina, Amar Psula. Rabbi Chanina says, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Rabbi say, Ketores must be compounded in a kli sharis. If you make it in a chulin utensil, it doesn't work. Rabbi Shimon Levi, Amar Ksher. Rabbi Shimon Levi says it's kasher. Ma time with Rabbi Yossi, Bei Rabbi Chanina. Why does Rabbi Yossi hold that if you compound ketores in a kli chulin, in an unconsecrated utensil, that is possible? So the Gemara says, Kodeshu shetei habiyase bakodesh, because it will say the Torah when it speaks about ketores says it's kodesh, it's consecrated. So because it's kodesh, every step of ketores must be done in a state of kedusha. My time to Rabbi Shimon Levi. So why does Rabbi Shimon Levi hold that even if you make ketores in an unconsecrated utensil, it's okay? Kadoshu shetei ba mitchumas halishka. Oh. Both say, because he holds kodeshu doesn't mean it has to be compounded in a kli sharis. Kodeshu means it must come from consecrated monies. So both say a really fundamental machlokes. Rabbi Yossi, Bei Rabbi Bon, Asid Rabbi Yossi ben Chananya Kishmuel. Rabbi Yossi who holds like Shmuel, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi Rabbi Yochanan. So both say each of them hold like other respective shittos. Ditaninan Hamakdish Nechase Vai ben Dvarmer Urgina Kabbanos Sibor. Both say the Mishnah said actually the next Mishnah. If a person consecrated his property, and amongst his property were items that were fit for sacrificial service, for communal sacrificial service, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Ketores. Rabbi Yochanan said that halacha l'maisa, that if it's ketores, you can use it for ketores. And I both say, now watch this. If I consecrated my property, and I have ketores in my property, how was that ketores compounded? How was it made? In an unconsecrated utensil. Yet again, the Mishnah says, it could be used in the Beis Hamikdash. What do you see from here? That ketores need not be compounded in a kli sharis. Amar Rabbi Oshia, Tiftar bu'uman mishal beis avatina shaynoto b'schar ketores. No. What's the case? Maybe the case is where the guy who was being makdish, his nechasim, his property, was a member of the Avatinas family who made his ketores, even who was paid to make ketores from the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore his ketores was made with kedusha. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, Kishmuel. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina holds like Shmuel. The Amar Rav Huna b'shem Shmuel. Mikat machteshas osu osa klisharis lekadesh. So we'll say the mortar that was used to go ahead and make the ketores, they made it like a klisharis. They vested it with the kedusha of a klisharis, which tells you that what you clearly see, that the compounding of ketores does require a klisharis. Amra Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bon, Amra Rabbi Chuna, Kumei Rabbi Yossi, Davar shekidish v'klisharis niftar, because something that is made in a klisharis be redeemed. See, Rabbi say, remember again, we assume once you're made in a klisharis, you can't be redeemed. Yet, what was the Mishnah talking about? Rabbi say, what do we do? What was the topic over here? Redemption or redeeming ketores. So Amrlei below the Shmuel Amar Kalhu b'Mosar. The Gemara says you're right. Under normal circumstances, you're right. Under normal circumstances, something is made in a klisharis, you can't redeem it. But Rabbi is saying here you have leftover ketores. It is better to be a little bit more lenient in the redemption of leftover ketores than what? Than not use it. Because we'll say, what are you doing with leftover ketores? What are you doing with it? Nothing. In other words, you can't really do anything. So it's better to be a bit more makel in redeeming leftover ketores than essentially leave it unusable for all eternity. So the Gemara says, this palgun, because this was a machlokes, host siru tamimim. So we'll say, let's you have animals, right? Karbanos tamimim. Karbanos timimim, not timimim. Right? Let's say you had unblemished sacrificial animals which were left over. You didn't need them anymore. What's the halacha? Shmuel Amar Niftin Kitmimim. Shmuel says they're redeemed. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Niftin Kipsulei Hamukdashin. Rabbi Yochanan says no, they are redeemed like Psulei Hamukdashin, which Rabbi say means that what? You set them out to graze, let them develop a mum, and then sell them off. Hosiru Seirim. Ultimately, again, Rabbi say if there were Seirim that were left over, they will say this is a case. Ultimately, again, let's say the Beis Hamikdash purchased some extra goats for the Seir of Rosh Chodesh, and I have left over. I don't need them anymore. So what's the halacha? Al daite the Shmuel im ola niftis lakoshkin chata. So according to Shmuel, if an ola is redeemed, certainly a chatas can be redeemed. Al daite Rabbi Yochanan am Rabbi Zira yiru. According to Rabbi Yochanan, you have to let it graze, develop a mum, and then ultimately could redeem it afterwards. No, you go ahead, you just repurpose it. You use it for dessert on the Mizbeach. How can you do that? How can you take an animal that was designated as a chatos and now repurpose it for dessert of the Mizbeach? In other words, we'll say to keep the Mizbeach not idle. Rabbi Yosef said as follows. Rabbi Yosef said, "Einachinami." In the case of communal chatos is different than a personal chatos. Under normal circumstances, you can't repurpose a personal chatos to something else, but a communal chatos you can repurpose. So the Gemara says, "She'ein karbanos sibar nikvan ela b'shchita." Tanai Beis Dinu ala Moishe shikr v'olo. So we'll say this is actually pretty incredible. So the Gemara says as follows: it could very well be that communal karbanos are different. That halacha lamaisa, communal karban is its identity is not solidified and concretized until when? Until the time of shchita. Because we'll say it's almost like an implicit t'nai within any karbanos sibor, which says that if we need to repurpose this, then what? Then what? We reserve the right to do so. And the only time you can't repurpose a carbon is when? Once it's been shechted. Because once it's been shechted, obviously its identity has been solidified and concretized. But until that point in time, if you need to repurpose it, you have the ability to do so. So Rabbi say, bottom line, halacha l'maisa, what comes out from this particular sugya? So Rabbi say, we learn a couple of things from here. Number one, the fascinating deconsecration process of Ketores, which is really incredible. Right? So you have leftover Ketores, you want to be able to use it into the new year. What do? You essentially separate it, identify it as the wages for the work people, the workmen, right? Identify that as their wages. Go ahead about saying what? Now remember, as you're doing that, there's another step. What's the other step? Separate out a corresponding amount of machzas shekel, deconsecrate that on newly built structures. You now have chul and money. Go ahead and now deconsecrate the ketores onto the money, pay the workers with the ketores, and now repurchase the ketores with the New Year's machzas shekel from the artisans. Everybody's happy. Artisans got paid. Halacha l'maisa, ketores has been bought back and can be reused. We then discussed, so now what do you do with the money? Both say, which money? The money upon which the ketores has been deconsecrated. What do I do with that money? So Rabbi says, so again, that's subject to a bit of machlokes. The easiest thing to do is use it to pay Garmu family and Avatina's family who are making Ketores and Lechem upon him. What happens if for some reason, halacha l'maisa, again, you didn't have the ability to do that? So Rabbi say it appears at the end of the day that halacha l'maisa will use it for Ketzah Mizbeach. It would go to the Mizbeach dessert fund to provide karbanos for the Mizbeach when no other karbanos are being brought. Rabbi say halacha l'maisa, what do we do about Ketores? Can ketores be compounded? Which also means when you're making the ketores originally, does it need to be made in a kli sharis, or can it even be made in a kli that is chulin? So we'll say we paskin halacha l'maisa that ketores must be compounded in a kli sharis as well. Every step of the ketores, from the beginning of its compounding to its offering, must be done in a kli sharis. So we'll say last important piece of information, which is the halacha l'maisa, communal karbanos have this fascinating t'nai attached to it. What's the fascinating t'nai? We'll say what's fascinating t'nai? That halacha l'maisa, Beis Din, or the Beis Hamikdash, reserves the right to repurpose it until the point of when? Shchita. Once shchita comes, which makes sense. Once shchita occurs, then obviously we're done. But until the point of shchita, Beis Din, the Beis Hamikdash reserves the right to repurpose it, and that's very important, because if you end up having leftover things, here both say, I'm sorry, we're going quickly, I know, but the part that I didn't cover was, the Beis Hamikdash always had karbanos in reserve. Why? Because animals run away, animals die, animals develop a mum, right? Whatever it is. So they always had, so you had these cases where you had leftovers. So let's say, for Rosh Chodesh, I have to bring a chatos, a seer of a chatos. So I will say, I have an extra seer chatos. What do I do with it? So therefore the Gemara says, Beis Hamikdash reserves the right to repurpose karbanos up until the actual time of Salah. We'll say, Shkayach, stop over here. Tomorrow Reb Kalman Akiva is giving shir for tomorrow's daf. We'll say Shkayach. Good night. Chavra on Zoom. Great to learn with you all. I feel that you're riveted by this daf, even though I have you all on mute. I'm mamish. I feel the energy over here. It's I don't know how I unmute you over here. Maybe you're unmuted. All right, I don't know. Anyway, Chavra, Have a great day. Good night, everyone.